A cop pulls over a teenager, expecting just another routine stop, until the boy looks up. His breath catches, his hands shake, because staring back at him is his dead son's face. The officer is frozen in shock. But when his eyes fall on the necklace around the boy's neck, his heart stops, because this isn't just coincidence. This is something far more impossible. And what happens next changes everything. A cop pulls over a teenager, expecting just another routine stop, until the boy looks up. His breath catches, his hands shake, because staring back at him is his dead son's face. The officer is frozen in shock. But when his eyes fall on the necklace around the boy's neck, his heart stops. Because this isn't just coincidence, this is something far more impossible. And what happens next changes everything. "License and registration," Officer James Reeves demanded, his hand hovering over his holster. The teenager fumbled with trembling fingers, reaching for the glove compartment. James tightened his grip on his flashlight, watching every movement with practiced suspicion. Then the boy looked up, and James Reeves's world collapsed. Picture this: a man suddenly face to face with the impossible, because staring back at him through the driver's window was his dead son's face. The same deep-set eyes, the same strong jawline, the same small scar above the right eyebrow. But Tyler Reeves had been dead for 2 years. James stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his fingers. The beam caught something glinting at the boy's neck, and James felt his knees go weak. A silver pendant in the shape of a caduceus, the medical symbol with 2 snakes winding around a staff. The same necklace they'd buried his son with. Marcus Johnson woke before his alarm, anxiety already churning in his stomach. Today wasn't just any Wednesday, it was interview day. The Westridge Medical Scholarship. His one shot at becoming the doctor he'd promised his parents he'd be before they died. His grandmother's voice called up from the kitchen. "Marcus, breakfast is getting cold. Did you press your shirt?" Marcus ran his fingers over the silver caduceus hanging from his neck, his father's necklace, the only thing he had left of him. Dad had been wearing it the day of the accident, and somehow the paramedics had saved it for Marcus. He never took it off. In the bathroom, Marcus practiced his interview answers. "Medicine isn't just a career for me, it's my legacy," he whispered to his reflection. An honor student with dreams bigger than the small suburban house his grandmother had scraped to afford after his parents' death. And still, none of it would matter if he got pulled over again. Because in Westridge, a black teenager driving his late father's Honda was always suspicious, always worth stopping. Across town, James Reeves stared at his reflection, barely recognizing the man looking back. Bloodshot eyes, 3-day stubble. 2 years had passed since they'd buried Tyler, and sometimes it felt like James had been buried right alongside him. The department therapist called it complicated grief. James called it living hell. He pinned on the badge that once made him proud. Now, he patrolled the wealthy neighborhoods with a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. He especially watched the ones who didn't seem to belong. They were always hiding something, he reasoned. And if he pulled them over a little more frequently, well, he was just doing his job. His wife Karen's words followed him out the door. "Tyler wouldn't want this, James. He wouldn't want what you're becoming." Now, standing on the side of Oakwood Drive, staring at a boy who couldn't possibly be his son, but somehow wore his face, James Reeves felt his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly. The interview was in 45 minutes. He'd allowed extra time, but hadn't counted on being pulled over less than 2 miles from his house. The officer had been following him for blocks. Now he stood frozen outside the window, staring at Marcus like he'd seen a ghost. "Is everything okay, officer?" Marcus asked cautiously. And that's when the officer's eyes dropped to the necklace. His face contorted with an emotion Marcus couldn't name. "Where did you get that?" the officer demanded, his voice cracking. His hand moved from his holster to the caduceus, fingers trembling. "Where did you get that?" "It was my father's, sir," Marcus answered, fighting to keep his voice steady. "He was a paramedic. He died in a car accident 2 years ago." "That's impossible," the officer whispered. "That's my son's necklace. I buried him with it. Think about it. What would you do if someone wearing your dead loved one's face appeared before you, wearing their prized possession?" "Step out of the car now," he ordered, hand moving back to his weapon. With shaking hands, Marcus opened the door, stepping out into the cool morning air, into a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. The necklace hung between them, glinting in the sunlight. A bridge between two broken families. A key to a mystery neither understood. Not yet. Marcus's hands trembled as he stood on the roadside, the morning sun beating down on his shoulders. The interview was in 30 minutes. His future hung in the balance, while Officer Reeves circled him like a predator, eyes never leaving the caduceus necklace. "I've been following you since Maple Street," the officer said, his voice unnervingly calm now. "You were driving erratically. Seemed suspicious." But Marcus knew the truth. He'd been driving 5 under the speed limit, using his turn signal for every lane change, both hands visible on the wheel, following every rule his father had drilled into him since he was old enough to understand what it meant to be black in America. "I wasn't driving erratically, sir," Marcus said softly, careful to keep his tone respectful despite the injustice burning in his chest. "I have a scholarship interview this morning. I can't be late." Officer Reeves didn't seem to hear him. His eyes had that faraway look of a man trapped in his own private nightmare. He reached out suddenly, his fingers almost touching the necklace before Marcus flinched back. "My son Tyler wore this every day," Reeves whispered. Said it reminded him of why he wanted to become a doctor, to help people like his old man. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. His own father had said something similar. The parallel was uncanny, unsettling. "I smell marijuana," Officer Reeves announced abruptly, his demeanor shifting in an instant. His hand returned to his holster, eyes hardening. "I need to search your vehicle." "There's no marijuana, sir," Marcus protested, panic rising in his throat. "I don't use drugs. You can test me." But Officer Reeves was already walking toward the Honda, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "I don't need your permission, son. Probable cause." The word son hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither fully understood. Marcus stood helplessly on the roadside, watching as the officer methodically tore through his car. His interview portfolio flung onto the passenger seat, his grandmother's carefully packed lunch dumped onto the floor. Every second ticking away, taking his future with it. "Where did you really get this necklace?" Reeves demanded, returning to stand toe-to-toe with Marcus. His breath smelled of coffee and something sharper. Desperation. "How could you have it?" "We buried Tyler with it. I put it around his neck myself." "I told you, sir." "It was my father's," Marcus repeated, struggling to keep his voice steady. "He died 2 years ago in a multi-car pileup on Highway 16. The paramedics saved his personal effects." Something flickered in Officer Reeves's eyes. "Highway 16, he repeated softly. 2 years ago." For a moment, Marcus thought he saw a crack in the man's armor, a flash of recognition or realization. But then it vanished, replaced by cold determination. "I'm taking you in for questioning," Reeves announced, reaching for his handcuffs. "It's too much of a coincidence." "Sir, please," Marcus pleaded, glancing at his watch. His interview was in 15 minutes. "I haven't done anything wrong. My grandmother can verify everything about the necklace. Can I at least call her?" "You can call her from the station," Reeves said, snapping the cold metal around Marcus's wrists. As Officer Reeves guided him toward the patrol car, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the window. His father's eyes stared back at him, filled with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained until his last breath. What would Dad do now? Fight? Submit? There were no good options when the system itself was rigged against you. Would you stand up to injustice if it meant risking everything? Or would you bend, survive, and fight another day? The station was buzzing with morning activity when Officer Reeves marched Marcus through the doors. Other officers glanced up, then quickly away, no one wanting to meet the eyes of the teenager in handcuffs or the officer with the haunted expression. "He stole my son's necklace," Reeves muttered to the desk sergeant. "Need to question him, run his background." The sergeant frowned, looking between them. "James, you okay?" "You look—" "Just process him," Reeves snapped, pushing the paperwork forward. Marcus sat on the hard bench, staring at the clock on the wall as it hit 10 a.m. His interview was starting right now. The Westridge Medical Scholarship Committee sitting around a table, noting his absence, his future slipping away with each tick of the second hand. "One phone call," he said quietly, when a young officer approached. "I'd like to call my grandmother." While Marcus made his call, Officer Reeves sat at his computer, fingers flying over the keyboard. Highway 16. 2 years ago. Multi-car accident. The memories he'd tried so hard to bury came flooding back. Tyler had been coming home from baseball practice when a semi lost control. 5 cars involved. 3 fatalities. His son, an elderly woman, and a black male, mid-40s. The accident report was still in the system. Reeves pulled it up, heart pounding as he scrolled through details he'd avoided for 2 years. Victim number 3, Johnson, Raymond. 43rd, paramedic with Westridge Emergency Services. Personal effects recovered. Wallet, keys, phone, silver caduceus necklace. Reeves felt the room spin around him. This wasn't possible. He'd seen Tyler's necklace in the casket, touched it one last time before they closed the lid. Unless the funeral home had made a mistake. Unless in the chaos of the accident, someone had mixed up the personal effects. Or unless something even more impossible had happened. The station doors burst open, and an elderly black woman strode in, radiating the kind of authority that needed no badge or uniform. Behind her walked a tall man in an expensive suit, carrying a legal briefcase. "That's my grandmother," Marcus said, the first hint of relief crossing his face. "And that's her friend, Mr. Patterson. He's a civil rights attorney." Officer Reeves watched them approach, a cold dread settling in his stomach. This was spinning out of control, but he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to understanding what had happened. Not when his dead son's necklace hung around a stranger's neck. "James Reeves, what have you done?" the desk sergeant whispered, eyeing the approaching attorney. The man's reputation preceded him. He'd won 3 major settlements against the department in the past year alone. But Reeves barely heard him. He was opening another file now, pulling up photos from the accident scene. Photos he'd been too devastated to look at before. And there, in the background of one image, barely visible but unmistakable, his son Tyler, kneeling beside a black man on the pavement. The timestamp showed it was taken minutes before Tyler died. Marcus's grandmother reached him, her hand gently touching his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked, eyes scanning him for injuries, before turning toward Officer Reeves with a fury that could have melted steel. "This officer detained my grandson without cause," she announced, her voice carrying through the station. "He's missing a life-changing scholarship interview right now, and we will be filing a formal complaint." But as she turned fully toward Reeves, something remarkable happened. The anger in her eyes shifted to shock, then confusion. "You," she whispered, studying his face. "You were there, at the accident." And suddenly, impossibly, the pieces began to fall into place. The station fell silent, conversations dying mid-sentence as everyone turned to witness the confrontation unfolding before them. Marcus's grandmother stood tall, Her eyes locked on Officer Reeves with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. "I remember you," she said, her voice carrying through the hushed room. "You were the father of that young man. The one who tried to save my son-in-law." James felt the floor tilt beneath him, his world shifting on its axis. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, but his voice came out as little more than a whisper. The attorney, Mr. Patterson, placed his briefcase on the desk, his expression grave. "Mrs. Johnson, perhaps we should discuss this privately." But Marcus's grandmother shook her head, her gaze never leaving Officer Reeves's face. "Number. This needs to be said. This man needs to hear the truth about his son, the truth he's been running from." She turned to Marcus, her hand gently touching the caduceus necklace at his throat. "Your father wasn't alone when he died," she said softly. "A young man stopped to help him. A boy who should have run from the wreckage, but instead he knelt beside your father and tried to save him." James felt his knees weaken, grabbing the edge of a nearby desk for support. The photograph from the accident report flashed in his mind, Tyler kneeling beside a fallen man, a scene he'd been too broken to notice until today. "The paramedics told us later," Mrs. Johnson continued, "that the young man was performing CPR when they arrived, that he refused to leave your father's side, even as the car nearby was leaking fuel. They had to pull him away, and when they did..." She took a deep breath, tears welling in her eyes. "Raymond's necklace was gone. We thought it was lost in the accident. Until weeks later, when a nurse from the hospital delivered it to us, said it had been found clutched in the hand of another victim, a teenage boy who died on the way to the hospital." The room spun around James, memories crashing over him like violent waves. He remembered the funeral home director approaching him, holding out a silver necklace. "We found this with your son, sir. Would you like us to include it with him?" James had assumed it was Tyler's necklace, identical to the one he'd given his son, had never questioned it, had been too deep in his grief to notice any difference. But it hadn't been Tyler's necklace. It had been Raymond Johnson's. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing to process this revelation. Tyler Reeves, Officer Reeves's son, had tried to save his father, had been holding his father's necklace when he died, and now, 2 years later, their paths had crossed again in this impossible way. Did he say anything?" James asked, his voice breaking. "My son. Did he say anything before?" Mrs. Johnson's expression softened. "The paramedics told me he kept saying that he couldn't let him die, that he had to keep trying, that his dad was a cop and had taught him never to give up on someone who needed help." Something shattered inside James Reeves. A dam that had held back 2 years of grief came crashing down. His legs gave way as he collapsed onto his knees in the middle of the station, his body racked with sobs that seemed torn from the depths of his soul. Captain Morris emerged from his office, alerted by the commotion. "What the hell is going on out here?" he demanded, taking in the scene with confusion. Through his tears, James looked up at Marcus, really seeing him for the first time. Not as a suspect, not as a black kid in the wrong neighborhood, but as a young man connected to him through an act of courage he'd never known about. Through his son's final moments of compassion. "I've been so wrong," James whispered, the words barely audible. "Tyler tried to save your father, and I've spent 2 years becoming someone he would be ashamed of." The station remained deathly quiet, officers and staff watching the scene unfold with uncomfortable recognition. How many of them had let grief or fear harden into prejudice? How many had stopped seeing the humanity in the people they were sworn to protect? What would you do if you discovered your prejudice had blinded you to the truth? That the very people you'd targeted were connected to you in ways you never imagined? Captain Morris approached slowly, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Let the boy go, James," he said firmly. "This ends now." But James was already reaching for his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked Marcus's handcuffs. "I'm sorry," he said, the words wholly inadequate for the damage he'd caused. Not just today, but for 2 years of misdirected anger. 2 years of dishonoring everything his son had stood for. Marcus rubbed his wrists, uncertainty in his eyes. "My father talked about someone in his final moments," he said quietly. "The paramedics told my grandmother he kept saying a boy was helping him, that the boy had promised he wouldn't die alone." James closed his eyes, fresh pain washing over him. That was Tyler, always putting others first, always trying to help. "I've been pulling over every young black man who drives through West Ridge," James confessed, his voice hollow. "Searching for something, someone to blame. I couldn't face that Tyler died trying to help someone, that he put himself in danger when he could have run to safety." Mrs. Johnson's eyes flashed with anger, but there was understanding there too. "Grief does terrible things to people, Officer Reeves, but it doesn't excuse what you've done." Captain Morris had heard enough. He turned to Marcus and his grandmother, his expression grave. "On behalf of this department, I apologize for what you've experienced today. Officer Reeves is suspended, effective immediately. We'll ensure your grandson gets another interview opportunity, Mrs. Johnson." He turned to James, his voice lower but no less firm. "And you, Jim, are going back to counseling. This can't continue." Marcus looked down at the necklace that had connected 2 families in both tragedy and this strange moment of revelation. "I still have my interview portfolio," he said suddenly. "The scholarship committee might still see me if we hurry." James looked up, a glimmer of redemption presenting itself. "Let me drive you," he offered, standing on shaky legs. "Not as an officer. As Tyler's father." Captain Morris started to object, but Mrs. Johnson held up her hand. "On one condition," she said, studying Officer Reeves with eyes that missed nothing. "You tell them what happened here today, all of it. The truth about your son, about my son-in-law, and about what you've become." James nodded, understanding the justice in her request. It was time to face the truth, about Tyler, about himself, and about the man he'd become in his grief. The man Tyler would never have recognized as his father. The scholarship committee sat in stunned silence as James Reeves finished speaking. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple button-down shirt that couldn't hide how much weight he'd lost in the weeks since the incident. His eyes were clear for the first time in years. Painful clarity, but clarity nonetheless. "I'm not asking you to excuse what I did," he said, glancing at Marcus, who stood beside him. "I'm asking you to not let my prejudice cost this young man his future." The committee chairwoman studied them both, her expression unreadable. "Why are you here, Officer Reeves? Why not let Mr. Johnson's credentials speak for themselves?" "Because justice isn't just about punishment," James answered, the words coming from a place of painful self-examination. "It's about restoration, about making things right." The investigation into James's past arrests had been swift and thorough. 17 traffic stops in the past month alone, 15 involving young men of color. No contraband found, no arrests made, just harassment masked as law enforcement. The department had placed him on administrative leave pending a full disciplinary hearing. Captain Morris had made it clear, James would never patrol Westridge again. His badge and gun remained locked in the station armory. His future with the force hung by the thinnest of threads. But the real judgment came from himself, from the knowledge that he had dishonored everything Tyler stood for, everything he had taught his son about justice and compassion. The committee chairwoman turned to Marcus. "And you, Mr. Johnson? After what this man put you through, why bring him to your interview?" Marcus touched the caduceus necklace at his throat, drawing strength from it. "Because healing doesn't happen in isolation," he said. "My father was a paramedic who believed everyone deserves a second chance at life. and Officer Reeves's son died trying to give my father that chance. James felt tears threatening again. The mandatory counseling sessions had uncovered the toxic stew of grief and anger he'd been drowning in. 3 times a week, he sat in a room with other officers carrying their own burdens, learning to face his pain without weaponizing it. Karen had moved back into their bedroom last week, a tentative reconciliation built on his commitment to change, to become the man Tyler had believed his father to be. "We'll take your application under consideration, Mr. Johnson," the chairwoman said finally. "You'll hear from us within the week." Outside the interview room, Marcus exhaled deeply, his shoulders finally relaxing. "Thank you," he said simply, turning to James. James shook his head. "Don't thank me. I'm the reason you needed a second interview." Marcus studied him with eyes too wise for his 17 years. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "my father always told me that we're not defined by our worst moments, but by what we do after them." As they walked through the campus, an unexpected question formed in James's mind. Would you tell me more about your father sometime?" he asked hesitantly. "And maybe I could tell you about Tyler." Marcus nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "I'd like that." The necklace caught the sunlight between them. No longer a symbol of loss and division, but a bridge connecting 2 broken families. 2 lives interrupted. 2 chances at redemption. 1 year later, Marcus Johnson sat in the university courtyard, medical textbooks spread around him. The pre-med program was everything he'd hoped for, challenging, inspiring, and moving him step by step toward the future his parents had dreamed for him. The silver caduceus necklace still hung around his neck, polished and gleaming. A reminder not just of his father now, but of connections that transcended understanding, of second chances and unexpected healing. His phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected friend. "Still on for coffee Friday? Have news about the department policy changes." Marcus smiled, typing back a quick affirmative. In the year since their lives had collided, James Reeves had transformed his pain into purpose. After 6 months of intensive therapy and sensitivity training, he'd been reinstated, not as a patrol officer, but as part of a new community engagement division. His first project, developing training for officers on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. Every 3rd Friday, they met at the same coffee shop. James would bring newspaper clippings about police reform efforts across the country. Marcus would share stories from his coursework, his eyes lighting up when describing particularly fascinating medical cases. And sometimes, when the moment felt right, they would share memories. Marcus recounting how his father would sing off-key while making Sunday breakfast. James describing how Tyler had insisted on rescuing every stray animal in the neighborhood. Neither man mentioned the impossible resemblance between Marcus and Tyler anymore. Some things defied explanation. Some connections existed beyond understanding. The department's new accountability procedures had become a model for neighboring precincts. Traffic stop data was now publicly available, broken down by demographics. Body cameras were mandatory and automatically activated. Complaints were investigated by an independent civilian review board. Change came slowly, painfully, but it came. Mrs. Johnson still watched James with wary eyes when he visited their home, but she'd begun including him in Sunday dinners, had even shown him Raymond's paramedic awards and certificates displayed proudly in their living room. Healing wasn't linear. Some days the grief still overwhelmed James, sending him back to his support group with shaking hands and troubled thoughts. Some days Marcus still tensed when a patrol car appeared in his rearview mirror, old fears rising unbidden. But they were trying, learning, growing. Picture this: 2 men from different worlds sitting across from each other in a crowded coffee shop. One wearing a medical student's white coat, the other in a police department polo shirt. Between them, a silver necklace catching the light. A reminder that our connections run deeper than our divisions. that our pain can either wall us off from others or open us to greater compassion. Sometimes the most beautiful healing comes from the most unlikely encounters. Sometimes our greatest teachers are those we've wronged, or those who have wronged us. The caduceus necklace had traveled an impossible journey, from a father to a son, from tragedy to hope, from division to connection, reminding us all that beneath our uniforms and our skin colors and our assumptions, we share the same human heart, the same capacity for cruelty, the same potential for redemption, and in a world determined to keep us divided, perhaps recognizing that shared humanity is the most revolutionary act of all.